Okay, I think we can get going. Welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us today. We're really happy to be speaking with everyone today about ESG investing, specifically within the world of nonprofit organizations. ESG is something that we speak a lot about with organizations we work with, especially more recently. And we know it's very top of mind for many investors, especially nonprofits. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items to cover quickly. If you have any questions, we encourage you to submit them both during and after the presentation using the box to the bottom right of your screen. And when we conclude the presentation, we will spend the remainder of our time answering as many questions as we can. And then any that we don't get to, we'll be sure to follow up with you afterwards. So my name is Paul Stanzione. I'm a portfolio strategist and a member of our endowment and foundation services team at Manning & Napier. I work mainly with our institutional clients and partners, and I have a primary focus on our nonprofit clients and partners within the institutional space. I'm joined today by two colleagues, Kelly Covley and Nick Centineo. Kelly is an analyst within our quantitative strategies group. She works as part of the team that manages several of the firm's systematic investment strategies. And most importantly for our discussion today, she's also very hands-on with many of the firm's ESG investing efforts, which her group spearheads. Nick is a senior investment consultant and a key member of our endowment and foundation services team. He's a very trusted and very knowledgeable resource for many of our nonprofit clients and partners. And specifically related to today's topic, he's helped a lot of organizations approach ESG with a focus mainly on their unique mission and their goals. So as a firm, we've worked with many nonprofit organizations over the past 40 years, and we've helped with objective setting and fundraising and policies and managing cash flows, educating boards, and the list goes on. But one of the most common things on which we've worked with clients more recently has been ESG, answering questions about what it is, what clients should or could be doing, how do they implement ESG into their investment approach, all sorts of different aspects of sort of the broader ESG concept. Today, we're going to review what ESG really is to provide a basis of understanding. We're going to discuss a few different ways that an ESG mindset can be implemented within an overall investment approach. And also, we'll specifically talk about how nonprofits can and do approach ESG. So to start us off, I'm going to turn it over to Nick to begin our discussion on what ESG really is.
Great, thanks, Paul. And thank you everyone for joining us today. So what does ESG mean? Oh boy. I think the first thing we can talk about is probably a lack of a consistent definition or even a lack of a consistent name. I mean, some people refer to it as SRI, socially responsible investing. Other people use the ESG term. I guess the most concise definition that I can think of is that ESG is a method of incorporating environmental, social, and governance factors into your investment process. And it can be used as either a risk management tool, sort of recognizing that companies that aren't good social stewards are exposed to additional risks versus companies that are, or it can be used as a tool to align your organization's mission with its assets. So in other words, making sure that your investments aren't working against your mission. Now there's many different ways to incorporate ESG into a portfolio. I think we'll probably cover those a little later, but because there are different approaches and because ESG can mean different things to different people, usually a good starting point for organizations is to just develop a good understanding of the range different options and the range of different definitions. And so really getting the lay of the land is basically a good place to start, I think. And I think that's what we sort of prepared for you today. Yeah, I'll look at ESG from a couple different angles and options for what to use it for. Kelly, I don't know if you have anything to add about how ESG scoring actually works in practice, since you're more familiar with that.
Yeah, sure. So typically, you're going to be looking at hopefully these three buckets somewhat individually, so you can get a good understanding of exactly what risks are facing a business. Typically, a lot of the time, you're going to be comparing an individual company to its peer group, so other companies in that industry, and you're going to want to look at both how exposed the business is to a given risk, but also how the business is positioned to deal with that risk. Is management coming up with a framework for coping with the risks it's exposed to? In terms of what actually falls into each of these three buckets, the environmental bucket looks at how the company relates to the natural world. So this can look at a company's impact on the climate, maybe through carbon emissions, but it can also look at how much a company relies on any potentially scarce natural resource. So is the core business running some water intensive process in a drought prone area? If so, they might run into some water scarcity problems at some point. The social bucket looks at how a company interacts with people. It can be people inside the company or in the broader community. This will include things like workforce diversity and working conditions, or things like data security and data privacy. I'm sure by now we've all seen multiple reports in the media of this or that company having a data breach. The social bucket also includes product safety and quality. So is there a risk that a company sometime down the road is going to face a product recall? And then finally, in the governance bucket, you're looking at how the company is run. So this will look at the composition of the board of directors, as well as executive compensation and how it's determined. And all of these factors can impact the bottom line of a company, but they're not really incorporated in traditional financial statements. So it's important to kind of actively seek information out on those factors.
That's great. Thanks, both of you. We know that ESG, there's a lot of elements to it and a lot of nuance at times, and it's also a very ever evolving subject. So Kelly, can you expand a little bit upon how it's changed over the years?
Sure. As time has gone on over the past decade or more than that, we've had more and more interest from investors, from regulators, and from the companies themselves. And this has led to a much broader set of investment options for investors, as well as better availability of data on these ESG factors. So early on, if an investor wanted to incorporate ESG, maybe they could exclude certain industries from their portfolio, but that was pretty much the only key way to incorporate ESG. Now we have products that are explicitly considering ESG risks that are material to the business, just as a component of traditional financial analysis. And this is typically known as ESG integration, which we will cover in even more depth later on. We also have a pretty wide body of ETFs that incorporate ESG now. These ESG ETFs can be really useful tools within a broader portfolio. As an example, we have a portfolio that's actively managing asset allocation using ESG ETFs as the building blocks for that actively managed portfolio. There's also been a lot of growth in data and ESG scores from third-party data providers. They can provide a score similar to a credit score for individual companies, but instead of looking at creditworthiness, they're looking at exposure to ESG risks. And we also have the companies themselves disclosing more information related to ESG and sustainability. In 2011, only 20% of companies in the S&P 500 were putting out some sort of sustainability report. And as of 2019, that 20% share had grown to 90%. But overall, there's been growth in the ESG space, and that's given investors a much wider set of options for how they can incorporate ESG depending on their specific goals.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and sort of just add something to that, Kelly. I think, you mentioned how ESG data providers are sort of a big component of how a lot of people get this information. And as the space has evolved, I think more and more data providers are kind of getting involved too. And I guess a fundamental issue, it's not so much a problem, but it's just sort of an issue to be aware of, is probably the lack of consistency across data providers, since so many different organizations rely on them to gather and assess the data. It's just important to just realize that they're not very consistent across one another. And actually, there was a really good article in the Wall Street Journal recently, I think it was last week, that it did an analysis of, I think, 1,500 different companies that had at least 3 ratings from 3 different firms that do these ratings. Nearly a third of the companies were deemed ESG leaders by one of those rating firms, but then labeled ESG laggards by another rating firm. So yeah, a lack of consistency. Ratings providers are sometimes measuring different things. Sometimes they're more focused on impact. Sometimes they're more focused on risk. Sometimes they're more focused on values. So again, just a little bit of knowledge about the range of different possibilities that are out there, I think can go a long way in sort of seeing how ESG has evolved and how it may evolve, how it may continue to evolve in the future.
Thanks, guys. So with some of that background about ESG and different providers and so forth, let's get in a little bit to now the concept of how ESG can actually be put into practice by investors. Nick, do you want to start us off here?
Yeah, I think there's 2 main categories that, again, they sort of align with that previous definition that we had, and Kelly also referred to them. The social screening approach, and then the ESG integration approach. So social screening's been around the longest. It just simply means identifying certain holdings, sometimes by industry, sometimes by social issue, sometimes on a company by company basis, and just deciding what you don't want to own for whatever reason. Usually because it might go against your organization's mission or its values. The cliche example would be something like a cancer charity choosing not to own tobacco companies, again, just excluding them from their investable universe. ESG integration is newer. It's definitely gained more popularity in recent years. It's broad-based in that it's not usually specific to any single industry or issue. And the other big thing about it is that there's a lot of different ways that it can be done. So one way is to integrate ESG data kind of like alongside company characteristic, other company characteristics like price and profitability, et cetera. There may not be a process like this may not use a defined ESG score or a minimum score, or a manager, isn't really trying to get at it that way, but maybe they just want to pick good stocks and then use ESG information as just sort of a measure of how risky a company is. Compare that to a process that uses ESG scores explicitly. Maybe you have a minimum score that you want to have to include in your portfolio, or maybe you have maybe you're trying to maximize that score, so you overweight companies with better scores, better ESG scores. Again, with integration, there's really no specific process for how it's done. It just most broadly means incorporating ESG information into your investment decisions. The only other thing I wanted to touch on this slide was, there's a few common misconceptions to think about here. in my opinion, there are not really ESG companies and non-ESG companies per se. It's more like there are companies that look better from an ESG perspective. There are companies that look worse from an ESG perspective, but there's no bright line in the middle that sort of divides ESG and non-ESG, in my view. Just because a company is in a certain industry doesn't mean it automatically scores better or worse on ESG. Oil drilling is a good example here. It's a pretty carbon intensive industry by most measures, but many ESG providers base their scores on peers within a defined industry. So an oil driller might actually have a pretty high score on the environment if they're relatively more friendly to the environment than the rest of their industry. So relative being the key word in that scoring process, I think. And then lastly, it's possible to do screening and ESG integration, both of these different options at the same time, because they're really trying to do two different things. Screening is really trying to avoid something specific, and integration is really trying to incorporate these factors into the investment process. So that's a lot of stuff. If you're confused, you're not alone. A lot of times, I'm even frustrated and confused by the different wording and the options and the definitions that are out there. I guess just realize that it's the main takeaway. It's not enough for a stock manager to say this is ESG, because you really have to ask specifically what they're doing, because there's different interpretations, and it's important to know that. Hope that helps.
That's really helpful, Nick, and exactly right. So now that we know that there are a lot of different ways to incorporate ESG into an investment approach, Kelly, can you speak more specifically to how we here at Manning and Napier think about ESG, approach it, and integrate ESG?
So we do allow exclusions to be applied to portfolios. This is that social screening approach that Nick discussed. And this is done at a client level because preferences and priorities can vary from client to client. But it's also very important to be aware of what you're actually excluding with that restriction. As an example, if there are concerns over controversial weapons, under certain very strict definitions of that restriction, it's going to preclude you from purchasing US treasuries because of the US government's stance on nuclear weapons. And so we can provide guidance on the implications of any particular exclusion to make sure there are no unintended consequences there. But at a high level, we do believe ESG factors can pose material risks to companies. So even in our products that are not specifically ESG products, we are incorporating ESG factors into decision making. And this is that ESG integration approach, where we're not wholesale excluding anything, but we are assessing ESG factors that are expected to be material to performance. And there are a lot of different ESG factors that can impact a company's profitability and in turn, how it performs as an investment. As an example, if a company causes some sort of environmental or social harm, they could face litigation that they have to pay for. Even if they're not breaking any rules today, there could be regulation down the road that they have to pay to come up into compliance with. So with this broad ESG integration approach, the analyst is going to be considering the impact of these ESG factors on the company's bottom line when they're trying to determine the fair value of any company they're looking at. And given our view on the importance of ESG integration, we are now UNPRI signatories. For those unfamiliar, the UNPRI, it stands for the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. And this is a set of 6 principles related to ESG integration in investments. All of the principles are really based around this notion that ESG issues can impact investment performance. So looking at these ESG factors is a part of our fiduciary responsibilities. Becoming a signatory to the UN PRI just demonstrates the sort of a firm-wide commitment to those principles.
Thanks, Kelly. It's a somewhat common concern among investors considering ESG that there may be some financial sacrifices when it comes to generating returns that can sort of come with the territory of implementing an ESG approach. Kelly, can you speak a little bit to those trade-offs, what there may be in that regard, and how investors seek to balance both financial and their values-based goals?
Yeah, there is a growing body of research that suggests funds that incorporate ESG don't necessarily underperform funds that are not incorporating ESG. And that really makes sense if you're viewing ESG issues just as another material risk factor that any company might face. If the market isn't pricing in litigation risk appropriately, ESG aware investors actually might have an edge in valuing the relevant companies there. And with the ESG integration approach, these ESG factors are really just another tool in the analyst's valuation toolkit. So we wouldn't expect that to have a detrimental impact on performance. Overall, relative performance is going to depend on how exactly ESG is incorporated. If it moves more from a value-oriented exercise to a values-oriented exercise, maybe through exclusions, that might have at times a less favorable impact on performance, especially if the exclusion is a really broad one. Of course, the larger the portion of the investable universe you're excluding, the greater the risk that you encounter tracking error relative to the benchmark. And with exclusions, I also would caution against relying on simple back tests to assess the impact of that exclusion, because the positive or negative effect of an exclusion is going to vary over time and in different market regimes. So if you had a restriction that excluded certain energy-linked industries, in 2015, that probably would have been pretty great for performance, but that's not necessarily always going to be the case across all market environments.
Great information, Kelly.
Sorry, Paul. I was just gonna add one more thing. I totally agree, Kelly, on sort of the tracking error thing, especially. You're going to look different from typical market indices. I think that's number one. I think specific to nonprofits, we always work with organizations to say, what are your goals and how do you prioritize those goals? And for most endowments, foundations, long-term investors, they're going to have a goal to grow so they can grow support over time, but a goal to also preserve assets so that they can sort of pay for withdrawal needs and spending needs today. And it's always a struggle to sort of balance those two goals, but that's pretty typical. Now, where do values-oriented goals fit within that priority? I think that's what leadership really has to ask themselves. I think it's definitely possible to pursue a goal of growth and a goal of having a value-oriented goal. I think it's definitely possible to pursue them both equally, and many organizations do. But knowing that sort of ahead of time, sort of establishing that goal ahead of time before looking at any investment options, before assessing any investment performance or back tests, that's what's going to probably make the most difference in whether you reach that goal or not. Clearly defining that goal ahead of time and then making strides toward it.
Yeah, that's important, Nick. Thanks for adding that. So turning our attention now more specifically to the nonprofit space, Nick, who and what types of organizations from what we've seen, have been showing the most interest in ESG?
Yeah, it's really been all sorts of organizations, religious organizations, human services, private foundations. I mean, it's been pretty diverse. Most of them have heard about ESG and maybe sort of read an article about it and wanted to learn more. But the principles of how to apply ESG are, I think, pretty suitable across all different types of organizations in my mind. I'd say the most popular sources for who is driving the conversation has been probably it's been driven from the top down. So it's been coming from board leadership, but it's also been coming from the bottom up, with staff and volunteers, voicing their opinions, or even influential donors in some cases, especially among legacy donors. I think there's a feeling of, if I'm endowing quite a bit of money to you, I want to have a say on how it's invested. And then vice versa, a lot of organizations are trying to get a good handle ahead of time on ESG, recognizing that future donors, maybe people who are younger today, they tend to care a lot more about ESG. They tend to be a little bit more knowledgeable about it. So, ESG is not the be all end all for a conversation. Again, it's not like I said this sort of before. It's not like you're ESG or you're not, because as we pointed out, there's so many different ways to implement it. But for example, for some screening is going to be enough to get you to where you want to be, and it's going to be what's attractive to your donors and board and your staff. For others, integration and having that broad social mindset, that's going to better serve your constituents. So I guess I just want to say that there's sort of not a one size fits all approach into how organizations are approaching it right now. It's really totally customizable based on what an organization wants to achieve.
Those are great points, Nick, and sort of to those points you've made, for organizations or board members that do want to explore more about ESG or go down the path of incorporating it to some extent into their investment program, what are the best ways to educate other board members or boards as a whole about ESG?
Yeah, so I've broken it down into 4 steps, and you can take these key takeaways as 4 distinct steps you can take. So number 1, I think, agree on definitions and the investment options. So know what's out there, know what each option means and sort of how they're distinct. I think number 2, understand the pros and cons of like a screening approach versus an integration approach. Again, they're trying to do different things. You can do them simultaneously, but understand what you're doing. I think number 3, review your priority of investment objectives and determine where ESG might be a good fit. So again, the typical priorities: growth, preservation. Another typical priority is maybe to grow in excess of inflation, recognizing that a lot of money is very long term and inflation is a concern. But where do values and socially responsible investing type options fit within that priority? And then lastly, number 4, stay up to date. This is a rapidly changing area, and there's information coming out all the time. Hopefully, we here at Manning & Peer want to help you stay informed, and hopefully we can help you stay up to date on how it changes.
Well said, Nick. Thank you. So at this point, with that, we'd love to take a few questions and answer a few questions. And while we start doing that, we'd encourage everyone on the line here to continue submitting any questions you have through the box at the bottom right of your screen. Firstly, I'll pose our first question that we've had submitted to Kelly. And the question is, how do you collect ESG information about companies?
Thanks. So a lot of it is really the same way we collect any non-ESG information about companies. So the analyst is going to look at disclosure from the company's industry or macro data, research from the sell side or media reports. The unique one for looking at ESG factors is the reports from the ESG specific data provider. So we get not only a score, but also kind of a breakdown and a qualitative analysis for why a given company is scoring a certain way. And one of the tricky things about the ESG data is that for the company disclosures, there's not really one standardized framework that everyone is using to disclose information. And this is a lot different from your traditional financial statements where you have, GAAP in the US, IFRS internationally. You really have a good idea of exactly what you're looking at, and you can compare things pretty well from company to company. With sustainability disclosures, most of companies, I do think, use some pre-established framework from another party, so they can't, just pick and choose metrics that happen to make them look good and report only those. But it's a bit of a patchwork as to the frameworks that each of them are using to report. Some of the framework standards have joined forces and combined in recent years, and that consolidation is probably something that's going to continue. But at this point, still a bit of a patchwork and not perfect comparability from one company to another. And this is where the ESG data providers can help standardize some of that information with ESG scores. But as Nick provided a great example of, the scores can vary a lot from provider to provider. It can be they're weighting things differently, or it can even be something as simple as maybe they're treating missing data differently. And if something's not disclosed, it gets a huge penalty from one provider, but not the other. And the discrepancies there, that's where analyst judgment can really add value. Our analysts can dig into not only the reports from the ESG provider, but also what the provider is looking at themselves, and they can use their expertise to either agree or maybe even disagree with how a company is scored on a certain sub metric.
Very, very good points, Kelly. Thank you for that. We have a second question. Nick, I'll go to you with this one. The question is, what do you think is driving increased interest in ESG?
The culture is the first thing that jumps to mind. I think a good historical example was like the divestment movement in the 60s and 70s. It's basically still with us today. But changing culture, the Vietnam War, that drove a lot of what investors wanted to do. I think demographics, it's sort of similar to culture, but for younger people becoming interested in investing, ESG holds a lot of promise. And the idea of doing good for society, there might be a lot of marketing hype there, but it's true that younger people tend to seek out more socially responsible investing options. I guess a third thought is momentum. It's a powerful force in investing. Because as something gains popularity, it gains assets, which causes its price to rise, which causes it to attract even more money. And so it can be a very self-reinforcing cycle. And I think for a certain class of investor, that is some of what is driving some interest in ESG today. I'm almost hesitant to point it out, but a company like Tesla, I'm not an expert in Tesla by any means, but I think there is a fair amount of money being put towards it because it markets itself as a socially responsible company, and it had done very well over the past several years, and so that's attracted more money to it. Just an example. So I don't know. I guess the result of that, or sort of how to avoid that, is not to invest in ESG blindly and excluding other things that are also important. I mean, the way to avoid things like a bubble are to take into account factors like fundamentals and price, in addition to possibly taking into account ESG factors too. So to me, ESG investing is not done in isolation. It's done in conjunction with other important things that have shown to be good ways to allocate money.
I think the fundamentals is a great point, because as you were talking about this, I was thinking about the one that's on my mind on the investing side, that I think has probably helped drive growth and will continue to, is the regulatory environment. I know it can happen in fits and starts, and certainly not a linear process, but it does seem like the trend is towards more regulations, especially on the environmental side, potentially in some of those social categories. And that could be have a big impact on companies that are exposed, or they're big carbon emissions generators. There could be more regulation down the line that companies may need. It may be costly for certain companies to deal with. And that is very much a fundamental issue that I think any analyst is going to want to be looking at, and any investor is going to want to hopefully incorporate into what they're buying.
Yeah. Thank you both for that. We'll do one more question here. And it's sort of similar to the last question we just discussed. So I'll throw it back to Nick to start, and then Kelly, please jump in as well with any thoughts to add. So the question is, do you think ESG is a temporary trend or a more permanent shift in the investment industry?
Yeah, I guess it depends on those motivations. If performance is the motivator, I think for a certain segment of investor, it is. The proof will be in the result. I mean, if performance is good, I think it's going to attract money. It's going to be a pretty long-lasting shift. If the motivator is changing culture and changing demographics, or even the changing regulatory environment, I think it probably has more staying power. Again, just the example of the historical example is the divestment movement in the 60s and 70s. It's still with us today. And it was sort of a permanent shift in how the culture viewed how to invest.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's spot on assessment. The only thing I would note in addition to that is in Europe, they seem to be a bit maybe ahead of us on this trend. They have much more assets in ESG funds, and even on the institutional side, a very large portion of institutions there are ESG is high on their priority list. Some of that might be because of the potentially more stringent regulatory environment over there and expectations for the trend. But if there any indication of, the potential staying in growth power, I would say that's a positive sign that it does maybe have some legs.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks both of you for great responses there. At this point, I think we'll wrap up. That's about all the time we have for today. So if there were any outstanding questions that we didn't get to, we'll be sure to follow up with you after the webinar on those. Also, for your convenience, a recording of the webinar will be emailed to all of you within a few days. Please, in the meantime, feel free to continue to reach out with any other follow-up thoughts or questions. Always welcome that. You'll also receive a survey after today's presentation, and we would truly appreciate any and all feedback you have for us. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. And on behalf of Kelly, Nick, myself, and all of Manning and Napier, thanks again and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.